Okay, we're taking a look at topic 1E, which is actually our last topic in this little mini unit. Topic 1E is talking about describing a graph. So we haven't looked at maybe some of these key features of graphs just yet. We looked at whether a graph is a function or not. So now we're going to look at when I have a graph, how can I describe it and talk about all the key features of it. Okay, so there are several things that we're looking for here when we talk about describing a graph. The first one is X and Y intercepts. This might be something that you've talked about, especially y-intercepts in other classes. But the x and y-intercept, those are the points where the graph crosses either the x-axis for the x-intercept or the y-axis for the y-intercept. So the biggest thing that people actually miss here is they misname their x and y axes. So the x, remember, is the horizontal axis, y is the vertical axis. Okay, so an x-intercept is just where it crosses the x-axis. So if I were looking at this line right here that I just sketched real fast, the x-intercept, if I were to point it out, now I don't have like numbers on here to talk about a coordinate, but the x-axis would be, or the x-intercept would be this point right here where my graph crosses the x-axis. So whatever point that is, -1, 0, -2, 0, that would be my x-intercept. Okay, the y-axis, well, that's the point where it crosses, or the y-intercept, that's the point where it crosses the y-axis. And this graph, that's this point right here. So we would designate that point as the y-intercept. A graph could have 0 x or y-intercepts. It could have one of them. It could have several x or y-intercepts. We're just going to look at the graph and see if we can identify it from the picture. Okay. The next kind of thing we talk about is whether it has a maximum or a minimum. Maximum would obviously be the highest point on a graph. A minimum would be the lowest point on a graph. Typically a graph has one of those two things, not both. It could have both, but typically it's one. So let's say I had this graph right here. Okay, well, this graph is going up forever. Okay, so it has a maximum, or it doesn't have a maximum. It continues going up forever. It does have a minimum, though. It has a lowest point on the graph. It would be this one right here. And again, I could write that coordinate. Okay. Increasing or decreasing, a graph is one of those two things. If we're going from left to right, the same way as we read, going from left to right, if it's getting larger, if it's going up, that's increasing. If it's getting smaller or going down, that would be a decreasing graph. Okay, and then symmetry, well, that's a line that we might have where the graph would be a mirror image on those two sides. We know what symmetry is in general, like our bodies are kind of symmetric. I have an ear on my left side and my right side, and it's a mirror image. Well, graphs can be symmetric also, okay? So if it does, then we're going to draw in that line of symmetry and then write the equation of it, okay? So let's look at a couple examples. The best way to look at this topic is to just do a couple, okay? So we have a graph here. This is actually an absolute value graph. Okay, so on this graph, I'm going to go through the things that we're asked to identify. The first one is any x-intercepts. Okay, well, x-intercepts, remember, are where the graph crosses the x-axis. This graph crosses the x-axis in two different spots. There's one right here and one right here. Now, as we mentioned on the previous problem, we want to write those as coordinates. Okay, so this one on the left here, that's at -7. That coordinate is -7, 0. Okay, the one on the right, that's at 1. That coordinate is 1, 0. Okay, so my x-intercepts are labeled there. Okay, y-intercepts. Okay, this graph does have 1. If I look where it crosses the y-axis, it's right here. All right, the y-intercept, where it crosses the y-axis, well, that's up at 1. So that coordinate is 0, 1. Okay, 0, 1 is the y-intercept. Maximum or minimum. Okay, I'm looking for max or min. Okay, this graph does have a highest point. If we look at the top, the graph does have a certain point that it doesn't go above anymore. As far as the minimum, if I look down at the bottom, it's got arrows on the bottom, meaning it goes down forever. So it has no minimum because it continues going down. The maximum, though, that's the point that it doesn't go above any further, which is at -3, 4. Okay, so I have a maximum at -3, 4. So I'm going to circle maximum. That coordinate is -3, 4. Increasing or decreasing? Well, going from left to right, at first this graph is going up. Okay, then it gets to that maximum, and then the graph starts going down. So we can't say that this is at any point just increasing or just decreasing. It's increasing up until -3, and then it's decreasing from -3 on. Okay, the last thing would be a line of symmetry. So if there's a certain point where it's the same on both sides, that's a line of symmetry. Well, when I think about the fact that this graph does continue, that makes it look a little more symmetric. The line of symmetry would be right here if I draw on that dashed line, right at -3. Okay, so when thinking about that equation, it goes to the x-axis at -3. That equation is actually x equals -3. Okay, because it goes through the x-axis at -3. It's a vertical line, so that equation is x equals -3. Okay, those are all the key features of this graph. That's all that we're looking for, just describing it like that. Okay, the next one, I want you to pause. Okay, try to go through those same exact things that we just did. So find the x-intercepts, if there are any, y-intercepts, if there are any, maximum, minimum. Is it increasing or decreasing from left to right? And then does it have any symmetry? Okay, so go ahead and pause and then start to identify those things. Okay, looking through this, I'm going to start with my x-intercepts. Okay, x-intercepts, so I'm going to look along the x-axis. As I follow along the x-axis, right there's one x-intercept. That's at the point 5, 0. Okay, so one x-intercept at 5, 0. Y-intercepts, going on the y-axis. Well, this graph never actually hits the y-axis, does it? It starts 1 unit away. Okay, so it never gets to the y-axis. That means it has no y-intercept. So instead of leaving it blank, because that kind of makes it sound like I don't really know what's going on, when I ask to write the y-intercept, I'm just going to say none. Okay, because that way I clearly indicate I know that there is no y-intercept. Max or min. Okay, the next thing, is there a maximum or a minimum? Okay, well, as I look along this, this graph does continue on in an upwards direction. But on the bottom here, it doesn't ever go below this point right here. So that's a minimum, right? It's a minimum point. It doesn't go any lower than that. It does go up forever. It's going to start to go up slowly, but it does go up forever. So this has a minimum at the point that I noted. And that point is 1, -2. That's my minimum. Okay. Next thing would be increasing or decreasing. Okay, so we are looking, my lights are on a timer again, just like your last video. Going from left to right. So left to right, as I go this way, if I follow the graph, that line that I just drew is going up. Okay, if it's going up consistently the entire time, this graph is increasing. Okay, and this graph the entire time would be increasing. So we can say that about this one. Last thing would be a line of symmetry. Well, anywhere I try to think about drawing a line of symmetry, like if I drew it here, it's definitely not the same on both sides. If I drew it horizontally, that's definitely not the same on both sides. So not every graph is symmetric. This graph doesn't have a line of symmetry, so I would say no symmetry when I'm asked to describe that for this graph. Okay? All right, that's it. That's it for this one. That's all we can say. One more here. This is actually a different type of graph here, one we have not seen yet. So I want you to go through those same things. This is the one I want you to try for class tomorrow. So identify the same things that we've been talking about. Talk about x-intercepts. Talk about y-intercepts. Talk about a maximum or a minimum. Is it increasing or decreasing? Does it have a line of symmetry? Okay, this is the one that I would like you to come with for class tomorrow. Okay, have it described so that we can start class going over this.